Hey, Pest Management, we love what you do. A third of crop production depends on you. Honeybees, yeah, well, they get all the glory, but there's other key players in the pollination story.
Welcome, everybody. I'm absolutely thrilled with how well this has been received. We've got people attending this webinar from all over Australia and even overseas. There have been people who have registered from Indonesia and Malaysia. So welcome everybody, no matter where you're coming from. We've got an action-packed program for you today, and I'm really pleased to be able to share with you information about bee-friendly farming. And that's not just the program Bee-Friendly Farming, but also what it actually means when we talk about what is it to be a bee-friendly farmer. So there's a number of benefits that we're going to be sharing with you today. Benefits not just about for the bees and the pollinators, but also benefits for the landholders and farmers. So we'll be really looking at what are the win-wins and why would people be involved in bee-friendly farming. We're also going to hear from some speakers who are going to really talk about the different applications. So whether you're involved in intensive horticulture, whether you're a small scale farmer, or whether you're involved in broadacre farming, there's these principles that we're going to be talking about have an application for everybody. And finally, we're going to finish up with how might you be involved and what are the benefits of being involved in the program as we support farmers and landholders to adapt and adopt some of the principles, which is bee-friendly farming. So if I can ask our speakers just to come onto the screen for a moment, just so I can introduce you and you know that they are actually here. So we've got Romina Rader from University of New England. Romina's an associate professor of ecology, looking at plant-animal interactions. We've also got Dr. Kevin Foster from University of Western Australia. Kevin's got more than 30 years experience in pasture production as a senior researcher in pasture science. And Lee Hanna is also going to be speaking. Lee is a pollination biologist. Lee is currently a PhD candidate with University of Western Sydney. Lee is also the Technical Support Farm Liaison Officer for the Bee-Friendly Farming Program. So you're going to be hearing from each of these speakers. What I would encourage you to do is to, if you've got any questions as we go, please put your questions into the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the page. We'll be making a note of those questions and they'll form the basis of our panel discussion at the end of the presentations. So we'll have, each of the presentations will run for about 10 to 12 minutes and then we'll have questions at the end. So I'll ask Candice, who's there managing our technical aspects, to share her screen, and we're going to start with a pre-recorded presentation from Romina.
Hi there. Today I'm going to talk about the value of remnant vegetation and other floral resources to insect pollinators in cropping systems. I'd like to start with discussing what resources we know are needed by the insect pollinators that visit crops. I'll then talk about the extent to which remnant vegetation and landscape heterogeneity support pollinator communities. And finally, how do all these things influence crop yields? What do we know about this so far and what are the knowledge? So who are the bees and non-bees and other insects globally that visit crops? This is some of the work that I did a couple of years ago with a team of students and other staff, where we tried to map all the different crops, global food crops in the world, which is on the left-hand side, against who their visitors were from the data that we collated in the literature. And so on the right-hand side, you can see some of those, which the figure's actually much bigger than I can show here, but just some key things that I'd like to point out. First of all, in the yellow is the bees, and you can see, as expected and as everyone knows, I guess, bees are really important pollinators, and the number of lines that come out of the yellow bee box shows you the vast number of crops that they actually visit. But there's other hymenopterans in the other than bees in that order. So wasps, sawflies and ants are also quite important visitors of crops. And then we look at other less known taxa like Diptera, which is the flies, Coleoptera, which is the beetles. We've got cockroaches, spiders, calembulas, and this is only the top half of the graph. There's all sorts of other insects that visit crops globally. So in our work in Australia, we've actually seen some of these in the crops that we've surveyed. So we've looked at raspberries, blueberries, apples, macadamia, avocado, mango, and you can see from the pie charts that we've got mixed assemblages. The honeybee is a really important visitor in yellow that you can see in a lot of the crops, particularly those under covers like the berries and the apples. But we also have a proportion of other taxa that are visiting. So the green is the flies, the blue is the beetles, and the green is the native bees, which is both social and solitary bees. So there's a bit of diversity visiting the crop in Australia. So why is this important? Why do we think that flowers are important to most pollinators? Well, it's kind of known, well, more than kind of known, it's well known, well established in the literature that flower plantings increase the number of individual insects, so their abundance of the same species, but also the diversity. So the different types, as I showed you in those previous slides, are increased when we have flower plantings in addition to crops. So whether it be on the field edges, which is in most cases, or in the surrounding habitat. And there's also evidence abroad to show that brood cell production increases also when you have flower plantings next to crops. And there's a lot of work with oilseed rape in Europe about this. So second, flowers are also important due to their value to pollinators. So having a diversity of different flowers means that there's a diversity of different resources for the pollinators to forage on, be it the type of nectar, the amount of nectar, the types of nutrients in the nectar, and likewise the types of nutrients in the pollen. Ensures that they have higher value and it's better for their health. But secondly, the other important point that's established in the literature, and why I've got a picture of a clock here, is the timing since the establishment of those floral resources is also important. So age since planting, the more established plantings are the ones that are more likely to promote pollinator abundance, diversity and health. And finally, there's a couple of studies abroad that have shown the impact of pesticide residues on the actual crops is reduced when you have co-flowering plants adjacent the crops. And the mechanism of that is not really clear at the moment, but there's speculation as to whether it's because there's a mix or dilution of foraging because they're visiting the co-flowering crops as well. They're not having a big proportion of the, for example, neonicotinoids in the oil seeds and things like that. So flowers are super important in many ways to pollinator communities. But what else do pollinators need beyond flowers? We know that they're getting carbohydrates and energy from their nectar. We know that they're getting primarily proteins and lipids and vitamins from pollen, but they also need habitat as well as those resources in flowers to provide them with their nesting needs, their shelter, they need water, they need special sites for reproduction, etc. So when we think about habitat, we've got to think about different scales of habitat. And while local floral plantings are important, the landscape, the broader landscape out to a few kilometres and the context of where that landscape is relative to other land uses, which is the context, is also really important. So vegetation configuration, which is the arrangement of it, and where it's embedded within other land uses, the context, actually influence when these floral plantings are effective. And there's been evidence that habitats in the more complex landscapes, so those with lots of remnant vegetation and natural resources, with a high proportion of natural habitats potentially host the highest diversity of pollinators. And this is because there's that age factor, that they're mature trees or plants that have been there for a while. They tend to be perennial as opposed to annual, so they're flowering regularly. And this is why we have the highest diversity in these landscapes. There's also an effect where we have varying amounts of disturbance in the landscape in regard to other intensive land uses can also affect when the floral plantings are effective. And there's a thing called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, that it tends to be those mixed landscapes that have some intensive land uses and some remnant vegetation that tend to fare best in terms of the performance of floral plantings. And thirdly, these remnant vegetation source habitats are really important and needed in agricultural landscapes because they're helping to build up the populations in the newly established plots from the pollinator regional species pools. So what about crops? How does this remnant vegetation go beyond just influencing insect populations? Does it actually provide anything to crops? Yes, it does. There's evidence in the literature to show that there's a positive relationship between the proximity to this remnant vegetation and wild bee diversity and visits to crops. But it does depend on the different land use types that are around. And some of these different land use types close to crops can also support pollinators, particularly when you're including non-bee pollinators like flies or beetles, etc. In particular, those that have resources like dairy farms with dung or decaying vegetation can support the larval life histories of some flies. And of course, there's carrion and other things. In terms of what we know about yield data, this is a bit less consistent, and it really seems to depend on the type of crop and the identity of the pollinator in terms of when we get really high yields in relation to vegetation. And there seems to be a stronger relationship with social bees because of their need for nesting hollows and particular resources than solitary bees. So social bees are more related to proximity to semi-natural or natural vegetation than solitary bees, because some solitary bees can nest in bare earth. This figure here is just from one of my studies that I published some years ago that shows that effect of distance to remnant vegetation. And when the line here, as in other bees, doesn't actually cross the zero line, it means that the effect is significant. So other bees have a really strong relationship with remnant vegetation, whereas the non-bees and the honeybees didn't. So as I just mentioned before, pollinators are using these other resources like dung, compost, decaying matter, honeydew, resins, etc. And we need to think about these resources in the landscape, and it means that landscapes with these lots of different habitats are more likely to have lots of different pollinators. So what about the non-bees? We talked about nectar and pollen, and we talked about habitat, but we need to think about these other larval needs that they might need. For example, water, for example, manure or decaying vegetation, because they're going to need that to complete their life cycle. So this comes back to that question of plant identity. If we're going to put floral resources into the landscape, what do we need to know? If we're going to focus for this point in time just on finding the plants that are really important to pollinators, we have to do field trials, we have to read the literature, we have to see which ones and which diversity we're going to plant. We need to know what our aims are. We need to know, are we aiming to focus on pollinator health, or are we wanting to get the highest yields, or do we want to try and get both? Because this depends on the types of plants that we're going to put in there. Is it compatible with the crop system? Is the plant that we're putting in shading the crop plants, which is not so good? Are the pollinators competing with the crop plants, which is not so good? Or are they facilitating it by bringing in more visits? And we also have to think about pest and weed issues by bringing in these plants. So stakeholder interests, that means the beekeepers as well as the growers as well as the landowners, will likely govern how successful the plantings are. And clearly there's going to be benefits and trade-offs. We might be putting in plants that are good for pollination, which may have some services for biocontrol. They may be less good for pests and pathogens, that they might be good for recycling if they attract flies and break down the plants, etc. So we need to think about these things. So in summary, The crops closer to remnant veg tend to have higher visitation rates, but these results are variable and we need more research. Landscapes with mixed different types of land uses, so high heterogeneity, often support pollinator abundance, diversity and health. We know that these co-flowering resources or adding restoration plantings improve pollinator health because of the diversity of resources they offer, but we still need to know more about these relationships between floral plantings, other resource and crop yields. Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks, Romina. So Lee, are you ready to jump in?
Yeah, sure, no worries. I'll just share my screen. Hi, my name is Lee Hanna, and I'm the Farm Technical Liaison Officer for Bee Friendly Farming. And as Fiona mentioned, I'm also a PhD candidate at the Hawkesbury Institute for the Environment, which is part of Western Sydney University. And here I'm investigating the potential benefits of extra crop floral resources on the health of honeybees used to pollinate Australian almond orchards. I've also had extensive experience in the private agricultural sector, working for a vegetable seed production company where I was employed as a researcher or a pollination biologist. So today I will be talking about bee-friendly farming. It is a certification process for commercial land users to promote pollinator health on their properties. So we set guidelines and standards for sustainable land management by ensuring certified properties supply pollinators and beneficial insects with food resources, nesting habitat and water. And it is also essential that our certified properties practice integrated pest management. So we have been running bee-friendly farming in Australia for 1 year now, and we're super excited to have 31 properties on board. These properties are covering an area of 31,000 hectares and covering all 6 states. We haven't got any from the territories yet, but I hope to get them on board. So some of these properties are growing produce such as apples, avocados, almonds. There are vineyards and pastures such as beef, dairy and sheep. So there are 3 distinct categories of bee-friendly farming, and today I'll be talking specifically about the first category, which is bee-friendly farming certified, and the second category is bee-friendly farming partner, which is specifically for individuals or beekeepers and companies who do not actively manage their own landscapes but wish to support our program. And the third category is bee-friendly farming garden, and this has been specifically designed for home gardeners, schools, public areas and community gardeners who want to promote and provide habitat and pollinator health, but not in a commercial setting. And so each category has its own, has different requirements and benefits. So bee-friendly farming has been specifically designed for small to large-scale commercial farms, including orchards, wineries and livestock. And this certification is rigorous and requires the most stringent compliance. So how does it work? So hop on our Bee-Friendly Farming website, navigate to the certified section and then click to apply for Bee-Friendly Farming Certified. This will open up an online questionnaire that you need to fill out, and that takes about 45 minutes to 60 minutes. Once we receive the application, it'll be assessed internally by our technical team, and then it is reviewed and hopefully approved by our fabulous scientific task force. And the task force has experts that represent areas such as bee biology, pollination and pollination services, entomology, integrated pest management specialists, agriculturalists and ecologists. So what are the criteria for bee-friendly farming certified? The first criteria is to offer floral resources that provide good nutrition for bees on at least 3% of your land. And this can include floral resources that include cover crops if they are left to bloom. So as Romina mentioned, floral resources provide a protein source in the form of pollen and a carbohydrate source in the form of nectar. Secondly, we need to provide bloom of different flowering plants throughout the growing season. So ideally throughout all 4 seasons, but it's particularly important during spring and late autumn as bees winter down. So these other floral resources can be flowering annuals and plants, native vegetation or restored native vegetation areas, as well as flowering trees, fallow crops, hedgerows and shelter belts, and even ornamental plants. Thirdly, we need to ensure that there is a source of clean water for bees. So this is particularly important for honeybees who require water to help regulate the temperature of their hives, but they also use water to dilute stored honey to feed to young bees. It is also a requirement to provide permanent habitat for bees to nest in, and this can be achieved through areas such as wildlife corridors, shelter belts, natural bush, buffer strips, and even areas of bare ground. So in Australia, we have over 2,000 species of native bees, and of those 2,000 species, only 11 of them have a social structure that is similar to honeybees. So that's where you have a queen, drones, and a whole heap of worker bees. But the vast majority, you know, nearly 99.9% are semi-social or predominantly solitary. So while our social bees, such as our honeybees and stingless bees, they need sort of natural or human-made cavities to nest in. All of our native bees, about 70% of them will nest in the ground, and the other 30% will nest in sort of dead branches, twigs and stems. So here I have an example of a ground nesting bee. This is a Lasioglossum mu, which is a sweat bee, and she's created a nest in the ground and she's just about to exit her nest. And another famous ground nesting bee is our lovely blue-banded bee. Other bees such as masked bees, leafcutter and resin bees and reed bees like to make their nests in the hollow out their nests within sort of pithy stems of plants such as dead tree fronds, bamboos, hydrangeas, and even in the flowering stems of grass trees. So here we have an example of a closed nest entrance of a Hylaeus or a masked bee. And so this bee will, once she's provisioned and laid all of her eggs within the nest, she closes it off with this beautiful sort of silky plug. And that prevents parasitic bees and wasps from entering the nest and harming her offspring. So the fifth and one of the most important categories, of certification for bee-friendly farming is integrated pest management. And this is a very powerful tool that helps mitigate risks to pollinators whilst managing pests. And it uses a multifaceted approach that combines physical, biological, cultural, chemical, genetic, and regulatory controls. So an example of a biological control agent here in the bottom right-hand corner is a lady beetle larva, and this one is munching on an aphid. And next to it, we have an Aphidius wasp, and these wasps also parasitize aphids. So she lays her egg within a live aphid. The egg hatches and eats the aphid from the inside out. It pupates and then it exits. So another essential aspect of integrated pest management is correct pest identification, ongoing monitoring, and record keeping. And it's sort of, the whole process is as decision and access process. So this diagram here is a summary of IPM processes. So you hop out into your field and inspect your field, correct identification of your pests and your beneficial insects, ongoing monitoring and record keeping. And then all of these records that you've collected and in analysed along with thresholds or models such as degree day modelling to make decisions on the type of action you need to take to control your pest insects. So all of this together, and every year that you run, you keep these records, and you need to evaluate all of your processes to inform decisions for your following year. So bee-friendly farming is working towards taking on the integrated pest and pollinator management system. And this model creates strategies for simultaneously managing pest control goals as well as pollination goals through integrated pest and pollinator management. So that's proactive management of field crops and surrounding landscapes. And all of our certified farmers are expected to practice integrated pest management in order to reduce or eliminate pesticides. So the sixth category is to pay the annual certification fee to support bee-friendly farming. There are 3 price categories, and that's dependent on the size of your land. And so once the applicant has been certified and a logo use agreement has been signed, you're able to use our logo on your properties, on products that are produced on the properties, for marketing purposes such as websites and social media, and on packaging materials. So compliance. So a compliance form must be submitted once every 3 years, and this is audited by our scientific task force, but we sort of expect all of our properties to be audit ready, and we will undertake randomised field visits throughout the years. So what are the benefits of bee-friendly farming? So there are huge environmental benefits. So creating safe environments for our pollinators and native insects, supporting biodiversity, promoting ecosystem health, and improving environmental stability sustainability, as well as landscape connectivity. And other benefits include a reduction in pesticides, that includes costs and hazards, increasing market demand for our certified products, priority access to tree grants for restoration projects, and our members will have access to our bee-friendly farming team, confidential support, and the latest scientific information will be shared with you. So yeah, so we want to create a network of like-minded individuals. So for further information, you can access our bee-friendly farming website at beefriendlyfarming.org.au. You can contact us via email at info@beefriendlyfarming, or myself directly at techsupport@beefriendlyfarming. And all of the information that I have covered today is in our Bee-Friendly Farming Handbook that you can download from our website. And I just want to share some of our wonderful partners who have come on board, and thank you for joining our webinar.
Thank you, Lee. We do have Kevin here, and Kevin is going to be sharing his screen.
Okay, thanks very much. Look,
Bee-friendly pastures and bee-friendly farming, a partnership to expand and secure Australia's floral resources. So annual and perennial nitrogen-fixing legume species are important forages across the entire world. These aerial legumes offer an untapped nectar and pollen source, and one that has been underexploited in Australia. Many of these trifolium species from overseas origins are adapted to dry areas. And by utilising these legume species as a pollen and nectar source, there is potential to improve bee health, the reliability of pollen and nectar supply, and the pollination of outcrossing agricultural and horticultural crops, and producing unique and novel honey products through these different floral resources. So at the Department of Agriculture and the University of Western Australia, we've got a long record of RD&E in developing new pasture species, both for ag and the pharmaceutical industries. We've done it for about over 50 years. And here's an example of our research station south of Perth. And here you can see all these different aerial legumes or clovers. And there is at the back here behind those trees is the beehives. And we get a chance to watch how these bees interact and feed on these legumes ad lib. And you get a chance to see the behaviour and see how attractive these legumes are actually to the bees. And most of these are outcrossing. So they actually do require bees to set seed. So what are the areas for BFP? So broadacre, as we currently use them for now, cover crops between vineyard rows, macadamia, almond and avocado orchards, in between non-bearing trees, old rundown pastures. If it's no longer good for a dairy farm, here's an opportunity for you. Fallow or unused land around farms, orchard margins or the borders of them, alongside rows or fence lines that are currently not being used for anything but weeds. And indeterminate here in the corner just means that for an annual legume, providing there's moisture, it'll continue to flower for longer. So many of the species here for our farming systems in Australia originated in the Mediterranean basin. The bees have co-evolved with their food source over there over millennia. So what we're trying to do here is rejoin the bees and the plants again in our systems. So for the bee, they get the nectar and pollen from the flowers, and from the legume, of course, it gets increased seed production because actually many of them actually have to be pollinated by a pollinator or a bee. So here's an example of some of the ones we've developed over the last few decades in Western Australia. You can see the different flower colours, different structures, and these all have different range of maturities and soil types. So it gives you some of the idea of the flexibility that you have. The one down here in the bottom centre, high cone rose, it can actually set seed without bees, but actually it does benefit by having bees. Look, here's an example of how we develop the legumes for our systems over here from a range of different soil types through the landscape. So on the top left-hand corner here, where the clouds are, you can see this is a sort of a yellow deep sand, and we've developed legumes for that ratio. And then as you move down the profile, right, from across the gravelly sands, the different pH to an alkaline sand, sand of a clay, a heavier soil type, right down here to the bottom right-hand corner, where you have these winter waterlogged soils, you have other options down like Balansa and Persian clover. So you can see from this one little image the range of clovers that we have, or legumes we have in the profile we can use. So the important thing too is to have a floral resource for the bees that's not just boom and bust, so that you have a long range, a long flowering window. So for the first time we've actually evaluated legume species specifically for bees rather than just for foragers for cattle or sheep. And what we did is we looked for early and late flowering types within a species. And here's an example here. Here's arrowleaf clover. It's generally late flowering type. Here's crimson clover, mid flowering. On the right hand here you have Moroccan clover, and this is new to agriculture, but it's got a lovely bouquet. The flowers are highly attractive to bees, and it's got an incredible smell. It's a perfume almost. And in the middle one here, with some plants you can select from within them, especially for outcrossing. So here what we've done is we actually found a crimson clover that's 4 to 6 weeks earlier than any other comparable cultivar within that species. And that's important because it gives the bees that early income of pollen and protein you need early in the season. So this is looking like, this is I think the end of July. And the corner here is another early legume. It's Prima, gland clover. And it's actually really interesting because it's actually really good earth mite resistant to a particular insect. So you can see here we've got, this flowers about 100 days in Perth, and this is probably around about 110 normally. Here's a mixture. So here you can see the three put together. So what we've got here is we've got crimson, Balansa and gland clovers. And what this does is it gives the bees a diversity from the nectar and pollen sources from each of those three sorts. Also extends the flowering window and the diversity. And there's that gland clover I said about having insect resistance. So cover crops, how do they benefit? Well, legume cover crops can increase crop yields, improve soil fertility. They fix free end because they're a legume, and you get that gradual release the following year, and that's really important both for the environment and for the hip pocket. Increase organic material, especially if you were to manure in the legume. Helps improve water infiltration, suppresses those low value weeds, and here's an example of a macadamia plantation that's sown to 3 different legumes: lucerne, white and strawberry clover. It helps conserve soil moisture while having a mulching effect. Even just for roadside beautification, some of these ones I'm going to show you later on are just beautiful by themselves, and they use crimson clover in the east for that purpose. It helps reduce soil erosion, especially when you have a slope. Visual appearing for tourists, especially during flowering, and you'll see an example in viticulture in the next slide. So here's an example of crimson clover. It's a really good source of both nectar and pollen. Look what happens here. I mean, visually it's stunning between the green and having that red there. on the slopes, and you get all those benefits we talked about in the previous slide. There's about 90 to 100 florets per flower of those red flowers. So you're getting about 500 million florets per hectare. That will depend on the seeding rate and the density of the plants, but that shows you the potential of how many flowers you can get per hectare for bees. Here's Balanza. This one here has been introduced from Turkey. It's sort of a mid-range, but have a look at this. This is low on the profiles. This is where the waterlogging would be. See how all those flowers are sitting up there like that? Really easy for the bees to access and very conspicuous. And look at the amount of flowers that's actually just on that one area. So you can see in this part of the landscape, we've got options even for waterlogged soils and beautiful flowering plants. Here's Sula, red flowering plant. It's biannual, at least for a couple of years. Overseas it's called Sula or French honeysuckle. It's really highly valued for its honey production and attracts a premium market price overseas. This is down at Albany, so west of Perth, and it's again highly attractive to bees. Very large flower, very easy to access, lots of nectar and lots of pollen. And this is the sort of honey it produces. Very light textured honey. It's gorgeous. I've actually eaten it. And the apiarists here who actually work with us on this experiment reported that it was excellent honey. Here's how they use in Italy. This is Sula in the fields. So here's how they've got all the hives surrounded. It shows you the value they put on Sula flowers to have all the hives here in one place. Here's James Bowie. He coined the phrase bees for beef, which is really cool. And James is very innovative. He's now got a 10-year plan of how to use bees and beef. He's got a vision on how to compare the two together in a sustainable system, not just for honeybees, for other pollinators as well. And he's gone here with a really good mix of 30 kilograms. And James is an example. This is southwest of WA, Manchester, sort of a medium to high rainfall zone. James has done a really good job of proving the system. And he runs Angus beef, so he's really mixing the two together here. And I'll show you the benefits of what you can get. So now you get the flower for the bees and the pollinators. Not only can you get the nitrogen from the legume, but you can cut it, if you do your management right, you can cut it for silage. So here's the silage he can now use in his beef system for the following over summer. So here's purple clover. This is an annual self-regenerating forage legume, late season option. Now, for instance, in WA, at this time of the year, most of our annual legumes are starting to finish off or have finished off. But here's a deep-rooted annual legume that you can see in the background here, purple clover, that's still flowering well and truly into December. And that was flowering and green mid to late December. Whereas you look down here at the Sula is actually finished, right? But here we have another flowering opportunity here. And again, when the apiarists took the honey out of the hives, reported excellent honey. Here's Persian clover. This is another late season annual. This is December 7th, 2020. This is our commercial partner. So he's got a bee train here that he can move around from site to site. And Rob's getting excellent seed yields from this because he's a seed producer. And he's also getting excellent honey yields from these clovers. So this is a win-win. So the bees are getting the benefit of the pollen and the nectar from the Persian clover, which they really love. And then Rob gets increased seed yield and he gets the honey. And he's got a commercial honey business now off these clovers. And there it is there. And you know, in the year 2020, Rob was the only person who had nectar flow from these clovers. All the trees around them did not have any nectar flow, all the gums or mallees. Here's the Persian clover honey. This is what it looks like. And here's one from multiple clover honey. So this is like a crimson and Balanza mix. And here's one that's won an award. Cradle Mountain Clover Honey, Best Produce in 2019. It's a premium product. And here in Tenerife, the Canary Islands, this is not a clover so much, it's a legume, it's a perennial tadera, it's been released in WA, smells like coconut. So again, as apiarists know, the source of the florals gives it the flavour and the texture, and here's one that's very unusual. Here's an example of the different range of honey and nectar colours within our legumes. So just within this little group here, look at the Balanza, the arrowleaf, Persian, purple and red. They're different colours and the textures, and I've tasted all these, and they're gorgeous. Just goes to show within just a small subset of the different range you can have. And a few take-home messages. Legumes are not just for livestock. They can help expand apiculture and BFF. We know that this works on a large paddock scale. We've got James Bowie as well doing it, and we've done this on 50 hectares plus. Our lit review also shows that many of these species are really well suited to providing floral resources for the industry here. In agri environments, we're very resilient to change, and we can manipulate our systems more than you can with natural forest systems, of course. and bee-friendly pastures can provide a good continuity of nectar and pollen supply for the beekeeping industry. And these legume mixes can extend the flowering window, and importantly, they're predictable. You know when they're going to flower each year. You're not chasing the gums or the mallees to wonder if they're going to flower and moving around. You can have a bit more of a stationary system here. And it increases your green credentials by being involved with these bee-friendly pastures. So what we'd like to do, if we could, is extend our bee-friendly pasture work to investigate more horticultural crops. So in the lower rainfall zone, the almond producers. But we've got the option of mixing these different seed mixes together across soil types and rainfall zones that benefit the farmer and the beekeeping industry. Ideally, you have a BFP picker tool, so you go online, you help choose the appropriate mixes for your soil, your rainfall zone, wherever you are in Southern Australia. But at the moment now, seed producers out there are producing their own pollination mix, and just go talk to them. And if you do have these poor structured soils, sandy soils, maybe in the almond industry, and you've got really low soil organic carbon, you know, if you use these legumes and you rotate them in, push them in, you're pushing the organic matter in, you know, you're going to help build your SIC, and you're going to decrease your nitrogen use the following year. So together, combine that partnership, BFP and bee-friendly farming, can provide opportunities for increased and reliable floral resources to support pollination services. There's an opportunity for beekeepers or industry to diversify, which is important, and develop products specifically for the medicinal properties, like Manuka. And here's a link to our project. The project only ran for 11 months, but I think you'll be impressed with what was achieved in that period of time. Some really good photos there. You get the whole backstory. I recommend go and have a look at it. If you have any questions, give us a call. And I just want to say to my team down here that helped me out, thanks very much to UWA and for this opportunity from Bee-Friendly Farming to present our work. Thank you for your time and for this opportunity. And again, this is a real partnership. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I've got a question here, Romina, perhaps for you. How would a floral planting be applied in a large beef operation?
Sure, I think that's a great question, and I think it can be put in either in set-aside areas or, as Kevin will probably talk about in the next slide, within the pasture itself, which then can be used by the bees and potentially used by the cows after that. So I think there's lots of options. It just depends on the farmer's interests and willingness.
Did you want to say something on that too, Lee? Are you happy if we address that?
Yeah, I think it's fine. I mean, yeah, similarly to what Romina said, you know, areas where you actually, where your cattle aren't feeding on, there are a lot, you know, creeks or along fences. You can plant floral resources along those sorts of areas. You can use our powerful pollinator guides for your region to find out which plant species are appropriate for your area. And yeah, so, and leave aside areas for your, you know, clovers or even lucerne, and let them flower and allow the crops, the cattle to come in afterwards. So.
Great, thank you. Got a question here from Tony. Are there strict guidelines with IPM on products that can be used with pollinators? Great question, Tony. Lee, that's probably a good one for you.
Yeah, so we're not an organic certification. So organic certifications do have strict guidelines on the actual products themselves. So within integrated pest management, we want to work towards reducing chemical use to only sort of, like, for example, to spot spray and whatnot. You want to choose products that have low toxicity to honeybees and also for our beneficial organisms that are on your properties. But the sort of the guidelines that we expect our members to follow also incorporate ideas such as time of day when you're spraying. So obviously when your pollinators are not active, preferably not during a crop pollination period at all. Also, you need to take into account how you spray, like I said, time of day, or using models or thresholds such as delta T. And you need to incorporate, so IPM incorporates all of these ideas to reduce the potential effects of pesticides, but ideally we want to work towards not using them at all.
But I think what's important is this is a very early area of science, what we're doing with bee-friendly farming and bee-friendly pastures. So there's a lot of things we don't know. But what we're finding is that every landholder has a different goal that they're trying to achieve about the plantings. So, you know, almonds, for example, they're really keen to have increased floral availability in the shoulder of their pollination window, so that they get, and their focus is on the honeybees coming in and leaving the pasture, that they're coming in and they're leaving more healthy. But other people are wanting to, their goal is to increase the number of native pollinators, so they want year-round flowering. So it really depends. These principles that we've been sharing with you can be adapted, and that's really what the learning is, what the bee-friendly farming program is, working with people so we all build our understanding. I've got another question I want to throw to Romina. Romina, you talked in your presentation about, you had the picture of the clock, and you talked about the timing of like how old the plantings were and how useful and beneficial they were at attracting the number and diversity of pollinators. I'm interested in what that means then in practice, given Australia's just had these, you know, I know we've been in floods recently, but we've had the terrible 2019-20 bushfires that really wiped out large areas of old forest. What does that mean for where we're at now, and what we can do about it?
Well, that's a huge question, Fiona. In terms of the bushfires, it depends on the type of eucalypt and the type of tree, right? Because some of them are able to regenerate. But in terms of the age of flowers, I think the scenario of remnant bush is really important because it's got a mix of annuals and perennials, right? So you have those sort of annuals that might respond to particular rainfall or temperature cues, and then they're flowering at a particular time when it rains or when there's smoke or whatever the cue is. And then you've got the perennial ones that are flowering at a given time each year for some species, and for others like eucalypts it can be a bit more what's the word, sporadic. Yeah, but all in all, if we have a diversity of vegetation, that's when we're going to get those matches and mismatches in timing. So there'll be floral resources hopefully all the time, and what we're trying to do is make them available. So having a mix of remnant vegetation, semi-natural vegetation, but also floral plantings to bridge that gap can be one management option to, you know, mitigate when we don't have floral resources. And I noticed someone else had asked a question about having competing floral resources, and this is potentially a problem if you've got a crop that you want the bees to go to, and then you're planting these other things that might be detracting from it. And I think that goes back to your point about knowledge gaps. So we've got some idea about which flowers are potentially more less attractive to particular species, like the managed honeybee, and a lot of beekeepers have that knowledge, and even growers would have noticed that. But we don't really know a hell of a lot about the other taxa, the wild bees, etc. But more importantly, it's not just that whether it's attractive or unattractive, it depends on the situation of when that is flowering next to the crop. So we have found that simple things like putting in basil in the middle of berry orchards, for example, we were testing whether the bees would come in only to the basil or whether they would actually come into the blueberries. And this is taking us, we thought it would be a quick study, but it's so context dependent that we found 1 in every 20 honeybees was jumping from the basil to the blueberries, and the other 19 were only coming into the basil. But without the basil, there were no bees coming in. So we were still getting some spillover kind of effect from the basil. And this is only basil. When you look at another plant species that you put in, you actually have a different effect from the honeybees. And this is a really well-studied managed honeybee, right? So those gaps are huge. We need to kind of know about the plant identity that we're bringing in. We have to know whether it's just the shoulder season that we want, as you said, for almonds, or can we actually support them at the same time with a species that might not necessarily compete in floral resource timing? Can we stagger it? And then there's also things we can do with the honeybees themselves, potentially, by manipulating the hive strength or things like that, how they're foraging, whether they're nectaring or pollen foraging. So there's a few tricks that I think we can in the future, but it needs more research. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, that's fine. There's another question here. Where can we obtain a list of native bees to our state, and how to encourage them into your garden property? And the person's from South Australia.
Where can you get a list of native bees? Atlas of Living Australia. You can do geographic searches to see what people have ID'd in particular areas. Lee might have some more information there. There's published guides. Okay, she's holding something up there.
A native bee book. Yeah.
Native bee books, of course. There's literature as well. Yep.
So I guess if I just mentioned there's another project we're working on, the Discover Bees campaign. In Australia, we've got about 1,680 named species of Australian native bees. But we think there's probably around 2,500. We've still got 1,000 Australian native bees to discover, document. So it's a major piece of work. So it's a good question, and it's one we're all wanting to work on. But as Romina said, Atlas of Living Australia is probably the best repository of information on that at the moment. Lee, there's a question here around tree grants, and where can people, what tree grants are available, and where might people go to access them? And I think that's probably one you can answer.
Okay, yep. So we're super excited to be launching our tree grants for 2022, and that kicks off in 2 days' time on the 20th of May. And you have to be Bee Friendly Farming certified to have access to the grants. And you can apply for these grants on our Bee Friendly Farming webpage, and they will be assessed. I think there's just...
Candice has just popped them in for you now.
Pop the link up.
There. Yep.
Yeah, so from the 20th of May, so that's celebrating World Bee Day, until the 31st of July. And I think each grant is a minimum of $1,000. Is that right, Fiona? So you can purchase different tree species to plant on your property and create sort of new restoration areas and supply nesting and floral resources for our beautiful pollinators.
And I'd encourage people to go to the downloaded planting guide. So we've got a number of bioregional planting guides published on the Ween Bee Foundation website that will help you locate species that are really beneficial to pollinators and help not just the bees, but other pollinators as well. I've got another question for you, Romina, around resilience. And there's a lot of talk about Varroa coming in and beekeepers' concerns and growers, in fact, growers concerned, the pollination dependent industries that are currently using honeybees, that if Varroa mite comes in, we lose our honeybees. What does that mean in terms of risk? I'm interested in your perspective on the usefulness of native bees and the role native bees play in commercial crop pollination, and can they and will they ever replace honeybees?
Sure. I think obviously the value of the honeybees that we can truck them around to wherever we want, and we can stack them as strong as we want, and they tend to be generalist in terms of their floral resource preferences. So it's pretty hard to match that. And when you see what's happened overseas with Varroa, there's a lot more management involved when Varroa comes in with the hives. But yeah, the honeybees can still be intensively managed to produce pollination services. But in terms of the other taxa, at least in the industries we've worked in, there's generally always other bees, both social and solitary, that are visiting the crops, as well as other non-bees. And it seems to be really context specific. So what I said in my presentation about vegetation and the type of land uses around the landscape, it does depend on where you are, and it also depends on how big the farms are. So really expansive farms that don't have floral resources for most of the year and then they come into bloom for a very short time, that's really hard to have wild pollinators around all year round because of that lack of continuity of floral resources. And the other problem is a lot of the wild taxa can't travel very far, particularly the smaller bodied bees. They've got limited dispersal distances. So they're is some limitations in only relying on wild taxa. So I think both a managed and wild taxa approach is probably the most resilient in terms of future crop pollination in Australia.
Kevin, I've got a question for you. My question is for you is in relation to clover persistence. So I think that I'm interested in that from the point of view of some of our livestock industries and what you see around bee numbers as a legume specialist. If you just talk to us a little bit about clover persistence and its importance.
So can you hear me now? Okay, I'll just turn this down.
Yep.
So we have long-term trials where we have clovers in the trials, and we manage, if they're managed correctly, and we don't have any disasters like droughts, then these annual seeding clovers, or even the perennial legumes, they'll persist in a pasture for years or decades if they're managed well. So once you set them up, the key thing is when you sow these legumes, be it the perennial or be it the annual, in your first year, you treat it like a crop. You've got to maximize the seed yield, maximize seed set in year one. If you do it well and you maximize that seed set, then that seed sits there, and a lot of them have got this capacity called hard seed. So if you get a really good year one and you set a lot of seed, then what happens is that even if you get a bad year two, some of that hard seed will sit there in the soil and it'll regenerate in year three. So persistence should be good if you manage it really well in year one and you continue to manage it for, with nutrition and grazing, the correct graze management. You should be able to have your pasture for decades. And some of the pastures I've seen in Southern Australia are 70, 80 years old. So you can definitely have a persistent pasture if you manage it right and you set yourself up in year one.
Terrific. Thank you for that. I think we might wind it up there. We've gone over time. I just wanted to make sure we were able to cover some of people's questions. There's a quick one. How long does it take for a business to become bee-friendly farming certified? Is there a qualifying period, and can business access grants while the qualification period of being certified? Lee, can you just quickly address that? Then I'm going to ask each of you for a final word. And if there's one thing people go away and do differently, what would you like them to do? But Lee, just answer that question and then I'll come to each of you for your final word.
Okay, so it really doesn't take long. The certification process doesn't take that long. The online questionnaire is fairly detailed, and if you answer all of those questions with detail and upload all of your photographs and documents, the assessment takes probably within 1 month. We can have the assessment passed. So yeah, it's not really a long period. Obviously, the biggest time it probably takes is to have the review of our scientific task force, which we meet once a month. So that's probably the only limiting factor in the certification process.
Okay, so look, thank you to each of the speakers. Thank you very much to the audience for bearing with us through our technical difficulties. Romina, I want to throw to you, if there's one thing you'd like people to go away and do differently that's really going to make a difference for the pollinators and for the land use, for the win-win, what would you like people to do?
I think, given my talk was about remnant vegetation and that heterogeneity in the landscape, I would be saying that it is super important, if there is remnant vegetation on your land or surrounding your land, to keep it, just because it means that there's resources for not only bees but other taxa. And then the other thing is, outside of crop flowering times, think about that continuity of resources so that bees can hang around and you've got more likely to have wild taxa and good honeybee health.
Thank you so much. Kevin, if there's one thing you'd like people to take away and go away and do differently, what would you like them to do?
I think probably this take-home message is that these aerial legumes, these clovers, are really an unexploited resource for the apiculture industry. And the marriage between bee-friendly pastures and bee-friendly farming is perfect. It's a great, great hand-in-glove relationship.
Fantastic, thank you. And Lee, the final word, what would you like people to do?
Yeah, well, I think similar to what we were discussing, if anyone attended the Powerful Pollinator webinar last night, which is also recorded and you can have a look from our website, is to, yeah, just plant more floral resources. You know, we have a limited capacity, carrying capacity of, anyway, just plant more floral resources.
Thanks, Lee. And if I can give a final one, it's please look, consider being part of the Bee Friendly Farming program. The information's all there. We'd love you to make a phone call, send an email, inquire, and the tree grants are available and they're a great incentive at the moment. So thanks everybody, and we'll finish with this wonderful video. Thanks to Romina.
Hey, Pest Management, we love what you do. A third of crop production depends on you.
Honeybees, yeah, well, they get all the glory, but there's other key players in the pollination story. But you never know this if you looked at the news. All you hear is stories singing about the honeybee blues, yeah. In the media, bees have all the buzz, and it's really quite a problem, and it bothers me 'cause
We need the
wild pollinators,
in agriculture too.
wild pollinators.
Most people have no clue.
Wild pollinators,
They're pollinating too.
and honeybees, sometimes you need their help, yes, it's true.
Now do you know that some of our native flies are pollinators and they're helpful allies?
For mango growers, blowflies are their best friend, 'cause they visit those flowers again and again and again.
They transfer pollen at astonishing rates.
It's unfair that these flies get so much of our hate, yeah.
Juicy mango's one of my favorite things,
And that's thanks to these flies and all the pollen they bring. We need the wild pollinators,
in agriculture too.
wild pollinators,
There's moths and beetles too.
wild pollinators.
They're pollinating too.
And honeybees, sometimes they do it better than you.
Well-managed honeybees, they face many threats, from poor nutrition to diseases and pests.
Environmental changes can play a role in affecting the pollination services as a whole. So
Diversity of pollinators may be key
for the future of global crop production stability,
if we want fruit and veggies on demand all year round.
we'll need both wild and managed pollinators to abound.
We need the
Wild pollinators,
in agriculture too.
wild pollinators.
We need to change